Hello and welcome to our 10th podcast. I'm Linda and here's Mike.
Hi, Linda. Welcome, everyone. In this podcast series, we are exploring social threefolding by reading and discussing the original 1919 book by Rudolf Steiner called The Core Points of the Social Question. Now, today, in our times, we are in need of a new social paradigm. Humanity is evolving toward a greater need for freedom, and so we are outgrowing old hierarchical social structures. Contemporary social life is quite dysfunctional, yet we cannot simply escape society. So, what can we do? Well, we can work on ourselves and we can create better organizations. And this, of course, is important, but it is still not enough. Our whole social environment needs an overhaul, and this goes beyond just patchwork fixes. Our whole society is unwell, and the task of social healing must be taken up with conscious social will. So, to heal our social organism, we must move beyond the back and forth of left versus right, of labor versus capital, and find a new threefold balance, something like the stability of a three-legged stool. And as we have been discussing, we must develop a new way of thinking, one that goes beyond the mere hollow ideology based on materialist science. Although there is no denying that Marxist ideology arises out of the lived experience of exploitation, this worldview nevertheless remains hollow insofar as it believes economic injustice and alienation to be the only sources of our discontent. In so many cases, even once these are attained, a much deeper discontent still remains. So, what will ultimately lead us to satisfaction? We must find something that makes our life worth living, something that gives life meaning. And this is not merely a personal matter, it is a matter of healing our whole society. Because on a daily basis, society has such a strong influence on us as individuals. Okay, so that's a little recap of where we're at.
Yes, thank you, Mike. That was great. And we have some viewer questions.
Yeah.
And so here's the first one. You contrasted science as tool with science as faith. In Steiner's view, is the proletariat's scientific faith actually just politicized technocracy?
Okay, thank you for this question. I believe this question is asking essentially what political role science played for the working class in Steiner's time. Was the old religious faith that was led by popes and cardinals not just being replaced by a new faith in science, now led by technocrats and social engineers? Which is to say, instead of being controlled by religious authorities, were ordinary people now just being controlled by different authorities? I think that's what the question is asking. And so I would say to a large degree, yes, I think this is a fair description of the circumstances. As Steiner indicates in his book, the people's older belief in divine beings who created the world and humanity as a divine act was replaced by the new materialist view of humanity having arisen purely through physical and biological processes. And yes, the agitators simply did replace the priests in a certain way. These agitators were the people who now educated the working class about what they were supposed to think about the world, about society, and about themselves. And yet, I would say there was more to it than just swapping one belief system for another. Whereas the older belief system of the church brought people into a feeling of connection with the whole universe and with one another, coupled with a certain belief in law, in higher wisdom, and purpose, the new belief stripped all this away and left only a kind of bare existence. I would say the new secular belief system was without an inherent moral element. It was based more on raw power, on the survival of the fittest, where the spoils go to the winner. And this is what allowed the social engineers of the time to unite workers into a single class consciousness, bent on a revolutionary seizing of control of the means of production from the ruling classes, and based on the dream of creating a new classless society of equals where no one was a slave to any master. And it was the strength of this conviction that this was a real earthly possibility is what transitioned everything from mere intellectual theory to violent action in the streets. So, to be clear, Steiner did not advocate for this. Instead, he suggested that the way forward was to create a new, liberated spiritual cultural life that would impart meaning and purpose to people in a way that was appropriate to our contemporary consciousness. Steiner was not a believer in social engineering, but rather saw the necessity of awakening to consciousness what already lives in people as an impulse to create a new social organization based on the free cultural area. So I hope that answers the question.
All right, thank you, Mike. And there's another question.
Mm-hmm.
And this one says, can you compare Steiner's spiritual science with modern scientism?
Right. So this is a very big question. I'll have to be very brief. Scientism is essentially the belief in the modern scientific method, the belief that the objective, testable, empirical methods of natural science are the only sources of genuine knowledge. Scientism denies that anything else, such as religion, philosophy, and so on, can ever be a genuine form of knowledge. Now, this view came to some dominance in the 19th century, and scientism did have a very significant influence on Marxism and the ideological framework of socialism. So, looking backwards, it pointed to figures like Newton and Galileo to argue that science can overthrow dogmatism and long-standing religious traditions. And this gave credence to the idea that science could also be used by the working class to overthrow capitalist institutions as well. Now, Steiner did not at all deny any of the knowledge that modern science has been able to attain. In fact, Steiner spent the first decades of his adult life engaged in research into the subject of epistemology, which is the theory of science. In various books during that period, Steiner considered that modern science imposes unnecessary limits upon its own knowledge. So, without getting too much into the weeds here, Steiner essentially argued that the essence of the scientific method lay in a fundamental process of interaction between thinking and experience that iterated its way toward genuine knowledge. Now, the core scientific method does not actually stipulate anywhere that our field of experience must be limited to sense experience. And on the thinking side, science is not limited to our current intellectual way of thinking either. So the limits science sets upon itself to sense experience and intellectual thinking are not inherent limits to science or to knowing in and of itself. And so if we could somehow develop more awakened, we could say post-intellectual stages of thinking based on rigorous training of the mind on one hand, while at the same time developing new qualities of experience on the other, it would be theoretically possible to develop other forms of scientific knowledge that went beyond the current sensory intellectual limitations. So, other scientific methods are possible, besides the one that has been so strongly developed as materialist science today. And Steiner himself went on to develop the theory and practice of new kinds of science and applied these new methods to the knowledge of the living world, to the world of soul, and to spiritual worlds. So I'm just saying this as a quick response to the viewer's question, in terms of social threefolding, it is not necessary at all to develop this kind of higher knowledge. For social threefolding, all that is really necessary is our healthy common sense. Now, is there anything else before we get started?
That was it, Mike. Thank you very much.
Okay. So I'll just say a few words about where we got to last time. So to recap where we are. So we had got about halfway through chapter 1 of the Core Points book. And Steiner is looking through the historical lens of World War I and the working class situation of the time. And he's providing a kind of rationale for social threefolding, which he will then, in later chapters of this book, develop in more specific detail. Now, in our last podcast, our focus had turned to a discussion of ideology. Based on materialist science, a materialist ideology was instilled into the working class through Marxism, and more specifically by the agitators who taught Marxism to the working class in the beer halls each evening after work. Now, this materialist ideology then became the identity of the working class. And to a large extent, this still remains true for many people today, even if perhaps in a different way. And just as many people do today, the working class imagined that we had evolved from animals within a purely material universe created through purely physical forces and substances. This particular worldview, based on the modern scientific mentality, disconnects us from the religious views out of which modern science itself evolved. Religious views that saw us as having a spiritual origin and as being intimately connected to the divine. So as a result, the working class people, and a great many people today, no longer see any relation between their own thinking and spirit. People have come to believe that our thinking is merely a material process produced somehow by the physical brain. And this points to the need for a new kind of science, an expanded science that includes not only the material, but also connects back again to the non-material. And this new spiritual science is what Steiner had spent most of his life developing and practicing. Now, Steiner firmly believed that a new kind of knowing, one that was appropriate to our modern way of thinking and understanding, could arise at any time, if only we could develop a truly liberated cultural life, one that was not beholden to state or economic interests, and that this new way of thinking would be what will lead us to be truly satisfied. Okay?
Yes.
So does that ring a bell, what we were talking about last
It
time?
rings a bell. Yes,
Okay.
definitely.
Very good. So I suggest we switch over to the screen share now and pick up where
Mhm.
we left off.
Okay.
All right. So we had left off last time we were on page 33 at the bottom there. We had
Hmm.
read this paragraph, "Herein lies the tragedy."
Hmm.
And it was a reasonably long paragraph that took us towards the bottom of 34. I'm just going to quickly recap that paragraph before we go on. So basically, Steiner was saying that the proletariat imagines that once they can take over the means of production and they can stop the ruling classes from exploiting them, then people with equal rights would regain the dignity they currently lack. However, Steiner thought the discontent ran deeper than this. The workers' discontent actually lies in the fact that their worldview has become hollowed out and disconnected from spirit. Because if their worldview was truly satisfying, the working class would express their discontent in a completely different way. And this points to the need to revisit the nature of our cultural life today. Okay, do you remember?
Thank you. Yep, I do.
All right, so let's pick up here. It's a very short little paragraph the ruling classes do not recognize. So I'll just warm it up and say just briefly that the ruling classes, meanwhile, do not see that it is in fact their own worldview that confronts them in proletarian unrest. the worldview of the ruling classes, in the course of being imparted, was stripped of its spiritual qualities and thus could only be experienced by the working class as hollow ideology. Okay, so would you read that, please?
Yes. The ruling classes do not recognize themselves as the originators of the very life ethos that currently confronts them, ready to fight in the proletariat. And yet, they became these originators because they were only able to bequeath something of their cultural life to this proletariat that must be experienced by it as ideology.
Okay, so Steiner's basically saying that what the proletariat is manifesting is a kind of hollowed out version of their own thinking process, the scientific method or the scientific ideology, and the ruling classes don't even recognize it. They don't see that this is actually their own ideology that has been passed on to the proletariat, right?
Got it.
Now, the next paragraph,
Yeah.
I'll warm it up and say the demand for social change is not something new. What is new is the character of the thinking of the working class. The working class, as well as people who align with the working class, might simply dismiss the suggestion that the character of thinking has anything to do with anything. Such people cannot accept that the social question is very closely linked to the cultural life. But a closer look reveals this to be indeed the case, that the real fundamental impulse of the modern proletarian movement lies not in the content, not in the ideas they discuss, but within the underlying character of their thinking. Okay, if you could read that, please, Linda.
Yes. It is not the fact that a change is demanded in the life situation of a class of people that gives the current social movement its essential character, even though this is what seems apparent, but rather the way in which the demand for this change is applied to reality, out of the thought impulses of this class. Just take a look at the facts impartially from this point of view. Then we will see how personalities who want to keep their thinking aligned with proletarian impulses smirk when it comes to discussing how we will, through one or another cultural effort, contribute something to the solution of the social question. They laugh at this as ideology, as gray theory. They believe nothing at all can be contributed to the burning social questions of the present day from thought, from the mere cultural life. But if we look more closely, then it becomes clear to us how the real nerve, the real fundamental impulse of the modern, precisely proletarian movement does not lie in what the modern proletarian talks about, but instead lies in thoughts.
Okay, thank you, Linda. What did you think about this paragraph?
Um, well, bottom line is like, let's look at the thoughts, not um, looking at the content, basically.
Hmm. Yeah, I think people are so focused on the content that they don't see the framework, and it's really the framework that is pr the problem here
Hmm.
more than the content.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean it's kind of like Steiner seeing a pattern, and
Hmm.
he's saying let's sort of have an overview and really take a real look at this rather than just getting stuck in the content of the thing. Let's see the pattern.
Right. And I think this principle applies today. We get caught up in the content of news events and how, what's being said and what's argued on one side or another. And we sort of lose track of the whole framework of how people are talking about this and how they're treating each other in the process.
Hmm.
There's a
Yeah,
lot of dehumanization that happens, for instance, even today,
most definitely.
right? And this is in
Yes.
this indicates something
Yeah.
deeper, all right?
Yes. Yeah.
So um, now for this next paragraph, there's a footnote in here, number 13, right around the
Hmm.
middle, and I'm just going to point to it that it refers to something that Steiner, when he was I don't know, younger or in his 30s, he was a teacher at a place called the Arbeiterbildungsschule, which is the School for Workers' Education in Berlin.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so he was actually involved with, on a daily basis, teaching socialist workers in a kind of after hours program. And he had a lot to do with the working class for a certain period of time.
Hmm.
Okay. So in this paragraph, he's basically saying that um, yeah, the modern proletarian movement is unique because it springs from thoughts. And many years ago, Steiner himself taught at this socialist school for workers' education in Berlin, and he had an opportunity to get to know what lives and strives in the soul of the working person. Steiner has also followed events in trade unions and various labor vocations, and so he believes he can speak about these matters out of real life experience. Okay, so if you could read that, Linda.
The modern proletarian movement is perhaps like no other similar movement in the world. And if we look at it more closely, this becomes clear in the utmost sense. A movement that has sprung from thoughts. I do not say this as a mere aperçu gained from thinking about the social movement. If I may be permitted to add a personal remark, it would be this. For years, I provided instruction in the most varied subjects to proletarian workers at a school from workers' education. In so doing, I believe I got to know what lives and strives in the soul of the modern proletarian worker. Arising from this, I also had the opportunity to follow what was happening in the trade unions of various vocations and lines of work. I mean to say, I am not merely speaking from the point of view of theoretical considerations. I am expressing what I believe I have gained as a result of real life experience.
Okay, thank you, Linda.
Thanks.
Anything we want to say about this?
No, it just makes sense that he is basically saying, hey, I've experienced this and I'm not just talking out of theory.
Yeah, he's confirming he's not really a working class person, but
Mhm,
he did rub shoulders a lot with working class people.
mhm,
He's familiar with their way of thinking. Yeah.
mhm.
Okay, so let's move on to the next paragraph. Um, so here he's going to be saying that it can be observed how a certain direction of thought, namely Marxism, has seized the souls of the working class in a very intensive way. A huge political divide has arisen between the working and ruling classes. The ruling classes cannot empathize with the soul of the proletarian because they cannot understand how an intellectually rigorous way of thinking, such as Marxism, could be taken up by so many uneducated people. Okay, could you read that, please?
Okay, sure. Anyone, which unfortunately among leading intellectuals is very rarely the case, anyone who got to know the modern workers' movement in places where it is backed by workers knows what a significant phenomenon this is, that a certain direction of thought has seized the souls of a large number of people in the most intensive way. What makes it difficult at present to take a position on social enigmas is the fact that there is such a slim possibility of mutual understanding between classes. It is so difficult for the bourgeois classes today to empathize with the soul of the proletarian. It is so difficult for them to understand how such a way of thinking could gain a foothold within the still unspent intelligence of the proletariat. A way of thinking that, no matter how we relate to the content, is intellectually demanding to the highest degree, as that of Karl Marx's.
Okay, so do you get it?
I feel like, yeah, I mean, Unless I'm missing something, he's basically saying that Karl Marx has put in a heck of a lot of thought into this. And how is it that these, you know, I don't know if he's saying this truly, but kind of like um, the bourgeois are kind of befuddled. Like, how is it that these uneducated have kind of taken up so vehemently, with this theory that is so deeply thought out. I guess that's what he's saying.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think Karl Marx, his theories are very intellectual. They're intellectual arguments that are well articulated, step by step. And somehow these uneducated, so-called uneducated people, the working class, have been able to take up this way of arguing, this way of sort of framing their situation in very precise language and very precise terms. And I think the bourgeois classes or the ruling classes are kind of stunned by this. Like how is that possible that these uneducated people are able to do this, handle this complex philosophy, you know?
Hmm. Hmm. Right. So the bourgeoisie kind of underestimated the intelligence of the proletariat, perhaps a little bit.
Well, yeah, I think they there's this fundamental belief that you have to go to school to be educated or something.
Hmm.
And I think they're missing the point that it's these agitators that spent so many hours with them, with the working class, and really educated them, went over this stuff with them, and they
Yeah.
really picked it up in a sort of adult learning environment.
Right. So the agitators did a really good job of convincing them.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm. Okay.
Okay. So this next paragraph, on page 36 here, independently of whether one agrees or disagrees with the Marxist way of thinking, it remains a fact that it has been revised by others in the years after Marx and Engels died. So it is a system of thinking that changes and evolves. The intellectual content of this evolving system is not so important. What matters most is the fact that a system of abstract thinking can become a powerful social impulse. Never before has a living social movement been based so entirely on scientific thinking. The workers' movement of this time is the first social movement to have a purely scientific basis. This fact is much more important than the actual content of the system or its possible variations. Okay?
Yes. Certainly, Karl Marx's system of thought can be accepted by one person and refuted by another, perhaps the one with reasons that seem as good as the other. It was able to be revised by those who, after the deaths of Marx and his friend Engels, looked at social life from a different perspective than these leaders. I do not want to talk about the content of this system at all. This does not seem to me to be the most important thing in the modern proletarian movement. The most important thing seems to me to be that the fact is present. Within the labor force, a system of thought works as the most powerful impulse. We can express the matter in the following way. A practical movement, a pure living movement, with the most everyday demands of humanity, has never been based so nearly entirely on a purely intellectual basis as this modern proletarian movement. It is, in fact, in some sense, the first such movement in the world to have a purely scientific basis. But this fact must be viewed correctly. If we survey everything that the modern proletarian consciously has to say about their own opinions and will and feelings, it appears to us through a penetrating observation of life that what is said programmatically is not the most important thing at all.
Okay. So again, Steiner's pointing to the quality of the thinking here. So most social movements arise out of some other kinds of discontent, like it could be some tyranny or some oppression that leads to some emotion or some economic real hardship, and that it's out of these emotions and hardships that the revolution or whatever takes place. But what is unique to the socialist movement of the time is that it's actually tied to this intellectual framework in a kind of unique way, so that the intellectual framework itself is part of the driving force of the movement.
Hmm.
And this is unusual.
Hmm.
So again, it points to the nature of the thinking. He's establishing Steiner's establishing a rationale for the quality of thinking of our times, and that this thinking has something to do with the social discontent.
I see it. I
Yeah.
see it. Hmm.
Okay. So
Thank
should we
you.
move on?
Yes. Yep.
This next paragraph, he's going to say he's going to talk about how the whole psyche of the working person has been strongly impacted by the fact that their thinking now has an intellectual basis. Because their thought life is mere abstract ideology, the working person cannot fully acknowledge their abstract thinking as a real experience within their own non-physical soul. They base their life on certain thoughts, but they experience these thoughts as something unreal. The dissonance between abstract thinking and lived experience is essential to understanding the true form of the social question. Okay?
Very interesting. Okay. What must seem really important, however, is how something in the proletarian feeling has become decisive for the whole human being, something that in other classes is only anchored in a single member of their soul life, the thought basis of their life ethos. What is an inner reality for the proletarian in this way? They cannot consciously acknowledge. They are prevented from this acknowledgement by the fact that their thought life has been passed on to them as an ideology. In reality, they build their life on their thoughts, but they feel these as an unreal ideology. There is no other way to understand the proletarian conception of life and its realization through the actions of its representatives than by comprehending this fact in its full scope within modern social evolution.
Okay. So again, Steiner's being a little repetitious, but
Mhm.
he's trying to drive this point home that, the irony may be that we base our ideology on thought, and yet we think of our own thoughts as being unreal.
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Some sort of irony of modern consciousness.
Mhm.
Okay. Do you want to say
Yep.
anything else to this or just move on
I
or?
mean, it's just in therapy, we know how important how we think about things, how it influences how we experience things, how we experience ourselves, the world, and other people, has a great bearing on how we perceive and how we think about this, what the narrative. So I kind of agree, and the fact that, we're not really recognizing that the thinking is a very real thing that can actually make a difference in the material world for us and in everyday life is interesting.
Exactly. Yeah. Very good. Very good. Okay, so let's move on. The next paragraph is a bit long, uh,
Mhm.
but, but it basically is going to be talking about how the cultural life is central, is crucial to the true form of the social question. The free cultural life of society must be positioned where it can guide our feeling and will. However, as long as the cultural life is experienced only as an unreal ideology, it must be rejected as a significant driving force for real life. For the modern proletarian, not only science, but also art, religion, morality, and law have become merely impotent abstractions. None of these offer anything substantial that can benefit material life. Instead, culture appears to be nothing but a secondary derivative, a mere reflection of material life. Perhaps culture can be helpful in a roundabout way if it helps people become more imaginative or inspired, but culture in itself is seen by many today only as an ideological formation arising out of material life, which can therefore offer nothing new to solve current social challenges. And that is why it is commonly believed that solutions can only be found within the material life itself. Okay?
Okay. From the way in which the cultural life of the modern proletarian has been described above, we can recognize how, in the depiction of the true form of the proletarian social movement, the cultural life must be highlighted as paramount. For it is essential that the proletarians should feel the causes of their unsatisfying social life situation and strive to eliminate these in such a way that their feeling and striving receive direction from this cultural life. And yet, at present, they cannot do anything other than reject, mockingly or angrily, the opinion that there is something in the spiritual substrates of the social movement that represents a significant driving force. How are they supposed to see that cultural life has a driving power for them, given how they must feel it as an ideology? We cannot expect a cultural life experienced like this to find a way out of a social situation that we no longer want to endure. Because of their scientifically oriented way of thinking, not only science itself, but also art, religion, morals, and law have become, to the modern proletarian, components of human ideology. In what prevails within these branches of cultural life, they see no reality breaking into their existence that can add anything to their material life. To them, these branches are merely a reflection of or mirror image of their material life. At any rate, even if these branches of cultural life, once having arisen, were to have a formative effect on material life again by a detour through human imagination or through absorption into will impulses, they arise originally as ideological formations from this material life. They cannot, of their own accord, provide anything that will lead to the elimination of social difficulties. Only within the material facts themselves can anything rise that leads to this goal.
Okay, thank you, Linda.
Okay.
So essentially, maybe my interpretation is that there's a certain belief that the brain is the cause of our thinking, perhaps. And so if we want to have better thoughts, maybe we need to improve our brain health or something like this. And in a similar kind of way, in a similar vein, there's a belief that the whole cultural life arises out of the material life. And so if we want a better cultural life, we need to look at our material health, something like this, right? So there's a
Mhm.
kind of analogy here that a belief that the economic life, if we improve that, then we will have a better cultural life. But there's no belief in the reverse that the cultural life has some kind of primal effect on our economic life. They
Mhm.
see the cultural life as a kind of offspring of
Mhm.
material life, as a kind of leisure activity that we do after work, but it's based on our economic life, and it can't in itself drive social healing, for instance.
Mhm.
That makes sense?
Yes, yeah. And I can see how that, how, you know, the hierarchy of needs, for instance. I mean, when we're in the hierarchy of needs, we need to survive. We can't think of the kind of, oh, what can I do art wise or developing wise or creative wise, right? We just need to get food and shelter and all of that. So I can see how that thinking has developed. But I also hear what Steiner is saying that, hey, look at the thinking behind all of this. And, it's not just the material world that actually, like you said, the brain, I like that analogy of, it's not the brain really that is the creator of thoughts, kind of, or thinking, basically. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think Maslow's hierarchy of needs has become a kind of dogma in and of itself, that we have our needs are sorted into this hierarchy, that we have to first satisfy these sort of bodily needs before we can self-actualize. And in
Mhm.
reality, I don't think this is actually true, that there are many instances of people who live in abject poverty who are able to self-actualize. And then there are other
Mhm.
cases where people are living in wealth and abundance who can't. I don't think it's really true. I think it is a kind of dogma, right? And we have to be careful of this kind of thinking.
Very interesting. That's a very good point.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the next paragraph.
Hmm.
So in this paragraph, he's going to talk about how today, in his times, um, our contemporary cultural life is but a shadow of what a genuinely free cultural life could be in the future.
Hmm.
Until our cultural life can be liberated, can be made free, people such as Marxists and others will remain convinced that the cultural life is impotent. And with this belief in the impotence of cultural life, they feel they have no choice but to seek potent social change in the economic life. They believe that capitalism is to blame for all the social problems and injustices we experience. And so, through the eradication of capitalism and the exploitation that accompanies it, the working class will gain freedom. Although most people today no longer consider the end of capitalism to be an inevitability, as orthodox Marxists used to believe, this belief nonetheless persists at a certain level. However, it would never occur to socialists who believe freedom can be attained through economic reform to ever say something that Steiner believes: if we had a supportive soul life that was rooted in a spiritual reality, then the social movement will gain the right impetus. Okay,
Hmm.
read that, please.
Sure. Modern cultural life passed from the leading classes of humanity to the proletarian population in a form that switches off its forces for the consciousness of this population. This must be understood above all else when the forces that can bring a solution to the social question are considered. If this state of affairs were to remain in effect, the cultural life of humanity would find itself condemned to impotence in the face of the social demands of the present and future. A large part of the modern proletariat is actually convinced of this impotence, and this conviction is brought into expression through Marxist or similar creeds. It is said that modern economic life evolved from its older forms, the capitalistic form of the present. This evolution brought the proletariat into an intolerable position with regard to capital. This evolution is supposed to continue. It is supposed to eradicate capitalism through the forces acting inherently within it, and from the death of capitalism will arise the liberation of the proletariat. This belief has been stripped of the fatalistic character it assumed for a certain circle of Marxists by more recent socialist thinkers. But this essence remains. This expresses itself in the way that it would never occur to anyone who currently wants to think in a truly socialist way to say, if somewhere a life of the soul appears, drawn from the impulses of the times, rooted in a spiritual reality and supporting human beings, then from this the force can radiate that also gives the social movement the right impetus.
All right, thank you, Linda. So, yeah, I wanted to say that in reference to this paragraph, in the last part, Steiner is arguing that he believes that if somewhere a life of the soul could appear that was drawn from the impulses of our modern times, if this impulse was rooted in a spiritual reality that would support human beings, then from this, the force would radiate that would give the social movement the right impetus. And he's essentially saying that, um, what the Marxists believe, or believed maybe, or still believe, I don't know, is that there was some sort of fatalistic flaw of modern capitalism. In fact, orthodox Marxism considered itself a critique of modern capitalism. And it believed that capitalism was fundamentally flawed and that it inevitably would lead to this wealth gap, to class conflict, and an eventual overthrow by a socialist revolution. And over the past century, people who believe in the inevitability of the end of capitalism have been waiting for the right moment of opportunity. There were the recent financial crises in 2008. There's various environmental disasters. And it's believed that one of these will be the catalyst that will demonstrate to everyone that capitalism is flawed and it needs to be replaced. And recently, the ones I've been hearing have to do with the so-called artificial intelligence, that there's people who believe that once human labor is made obsolete, the whole profit-driven capitalist model will collapse because the model is based on human labor being rewarded with income to purchase goods and services. So if there's no longer any need for human labor because of artificial intelligence, then there's no need for capitalism and we'll simply evolve towards a new socialist society. So that's the latest flavor of this belief, right? But at
Mhm.
the same time, we have to consider what happens if the element of capital were to be removed from society. If there was no longer any motive to create and maintain capital, then what would happen? And we've seen this historically in the 20th century.
Mhm.
If capital is not continually being produced and replaced, then the labor saving effects of capital will fall away, and we will invariably return to an older, more labor intensive lifestyle. So if the sources of capital dry up, people will have no choice but to go back to physical labor. And so there's this kind of back and forth between capitalism and labor. And this is why social threefolding does not advocate for the eradication of capital, but instead it looks for a way forward that will increase prosperity for all. And this is done first by relocating labor into the area of the rights life, out of, they're not part of the economic life anymore. If labor was part of the rights life, then labor entitlements and obligations become a matter of rights and not economics, not commodities. And secondly, by bringing capital into a new ownership framework, one that is neither one-sidedly private nor one-sidedly public. So these are the core topics, labor and capital in a threefold society. And we'll expand upon these topics in greater depth when we get to chapter 3 of this book. So we're still working our way through chapter 1, which is giving the rationale. And then chapter 2 will describe social threefolding itself. And then chapter 3 will talk more about labor and capital. Okay? So that's kind of a picture of where we're going.
Very cool. Thank you, Mike. I mean, it's definitely interesting. I'm sort of have some curiosities that I won't ask right now, but that is around, the experience of um, what you just described, when we have the disappearance of capitalism, that it goes into even harder labor because all of these, I guess, the conveniences and all of that is taken away, and the sort of that flow between, capitalism and socialism, and then how threefolding can come in, and say, so we're not going to go, that we're going to take maybe the best out of both of those worlds and add as something that is very important and fundamental. I think it sounds like, putting labor into the rights life is a major sort of shift. And I'm really curious as to how sort of making labor right um, how does that kind of um, affect social, like, I mean, if a business isn't working, and they're not creating a profit, what happens to that worker, right? And does the owner of the company have to pay them still, even though they're not making a profit? Those kinds of questions, kind of, it's interesting to me. And what is the incentive if they have to pay? What is the incentive of the if the business or the associations and saying, oh, look, we need 100,000 eggs for this community, and that's it. There's a cap. There's no more, no less kind of thing. And so the people that really are incentivized by setting goals and bigger and better, and in the capitalist world, that the power, all of that brings, obviously not going to be there, because this seems like a fundamental shift of, okay, just enough. It's kind of like the Goldilocks, sort of just enough, bringing in. So these are the questions that are kind of stirring in me right now. So
You asked a
yeah,
lot of questions. I don't know if I have the mental capacity to capture everything you just said.
yeah.
But we will be talking about these topics as we go.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, I will say maybe for now, I just want to paint a picture that capital doesn't exist by through nature. Okay, capital. So trees will grow on their own, but capital does not just grow on its own. And so we have to do something to create capital. We have to do something to make it appear and also to maintain it. So we can't just assume that once, we create a world where there's a lot of capital, that we can just stop developing capital and that we can abandon capitalism. I think if we did that, what we'll see is that the capital will eventually just wear out, and then there just won't be any capital anymore. And then we will be thrust back into a labor-based society surrounded by all this sort of useless capital. So what I'm trying to argue is if we want to keep this kind of wealth, this that capitalism has brought, we have to find a way to maintain the capitalist stream, but only kind of switch off all this exploitation that is truly a critique, right? So how can we move forward with the development of capital, but at the same time stop all this indignity and exploitation that happens? This is not inherent to capital. It's actually inherent to how capital is owned and managed. And Steiner will say later in the book that the problem with capital is that it has become owned and managed through the economic life. This is fundamentally the problem. And if we can find a way to take the ownership and management of capital out of the economic life, then we can create a threefold society in which capital can have a healthy role in our society, not an unhealthy one.
Okay.
That's the view. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but it doesn't, because I
Yeah.
don't have the full picture. So yeah, but
Yeah, this
thank
will
you for
take
that.
this will take us some time to develop these ideas, but I
Hmm.
just want to frame them so that the listeners to our podcast can know kind of where we're headed with this. And we're not
Yeah.
going to be talking incessantly about the working class. This is just chapter one
Hmm.
right now, and
Hmm.
we'll soon move on to other topics and more solution-oriented discussions.
Got it.
Okay?
Yes. Thank you, Mike.
Okay, so I think that's where we'll wrap it up for today,
Sounds good.
and we'll see you next time.
Sounds good. See you next time.
Okay, bye now.
Bye.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit like and subscribe.